There's no briefing required tonight. You can simply listen. The story starts softly, designed to fade into the background as you rest. The last thing I remember before the cluster swallowed us was the color of the gas giant. It filled half the view as we burned in on the shuttle, a swollen mass of shifting bands and storms. It looked almost calm from that distance, all soft diffusion and slow swirls, but the numbers on the display said otherwise. Gravity here chewed at orbits, pulled at metal, distorted trajectories. Even dead ships didn't rest. They drifted, collided, fused, and tore apart again in quiet cycles that had been going on since the first engagement in this system. The cluster was the visible proof. A tangle of hulls and station sections suspended above the cloud tops, welded together by chance impacts and emergency docking locks that never released. Someone back then had tried to save what was left. It hadn't worked. The result was a knot of dark metal and broken geometry, rolling slowly in the giant's grip. 2 boarding teams had gone in and never come back out. We were the third. The shuttle's engines cut out into a dull, familiar vibration. Then came the soft tap of maneuvering thrusters, the subtle shift in my restraints as the nose dipped and corrected. Inside my helmet, the sound of my own breathing was louder than the ship, measured and steady, kept in rhythm with the faint hiss of life support. I watched the cluster grow in the forward port, a silhouette of jagged lines and torn decks. Navigation overlaid ghostly outlines of ship classes and station frames, trying to match old schematics to the broken skeleton in front of us. None of it lined up well. We latched onto a hull that had once been a carrier's dorsal plate. The magnetic clamps thumped through the floor. The shuttle's light flickered as the system shunted power to docking seals and external gantries. I cycled my suit, watching the readouts: oxygen, 98%, filters, green, radiation, baseline elevated but within tolerances, joint servos, nominal. The hatch opened onto a rectangle of darkness. I engaged my mag boots and moved with the others out of the shuttle and onto the hull. Each step landed with a dull, cramped thud. The metal underfoot was rough, patched with repair plates, gouged in places where debris had struck and scraped along the surface like claws. The gas giant curved below us, a wall of muted color and silent storms. Above, the derelicts rose in layers, packed so tightly that the sky was nothing but steel. My helmet lights cut a narrow tunnel through the dark. Ahead, an old maintenance airlock gaped open, its outer doors stuck halfway into the track. Someone had forced it cycles ago. The diagnostic pings showed stale trace atmosphere inside, thin and contaminated. That matched the last logs from the missing teams. We followed their path in. Inside the carrier shell, gravity was intermittent. Some sections still had active plating, others hadn't worked in years. Stepping through those boundaries was something you felt more than saw. The drag on your limbs fading, the weight lifting off your shoulders, the subtle shift in how your own mass answered each movement. My boots clanked for 3 paces, and then suddenly I was half floating, the suit's thrusters whispering to keep me oriented as my foot found nothing solid in the next step. The corridor ahead sagged, its bulkheads buckled outward from some old internal explosion. Strips of lighting that no longer glowed hung like dead vines. My visor picked up drifting clouds of insulation fibers and metallic dust, all hanging in the air like smoke frozen mid-breath. I swept the sensor array along the walls, watching the feed in the corner of my display. Structural readings came back as fractured but stable. Life signatures, none, aside from our own IFF tags. Motion, minimal. Thermal, dispersed hotspots from old circuits and garbage fires long gone cold. The map overlay looked wrong. We advanced in a staggered file, tethered to the main corridor line. Each of us had a line reel at our belt, and the primary anchor ran along the deck, clamped in at intervals. Lose the map, you follow the tether. Lose the tether, you follow whatever you can touch. Lose that, and you drift until the cluster digests you. That was the rule. My job was the map and the hull. Sensors, integrity checks, demolition charges. I kept half my attention on the corridor ahead and half on the feeds, letting suit reflex manage my movements. The numbers came in waves. I watched them settle, rise, fall. When they drifted out of tolerance, I tagged the spot in my HUD and relayed it back to the shuttle. Someone there tried to assemble all our little patches of certainty into something like a picture. Behind me, I could feel the familiar presence of the others, even without looking. The steady crunch of mag boots on metal, the faint squeal of a servo motor overcompensating in a joint, the exhalation of air in a respirator. It was a rhythm I had heard in a dozen other hulls. It was almost comforting in its ugliness. Almost. The first residue from the previous teams showed up 3 bulkheads in, a streak of blackened metal along the wall where a charge had gone off, and a cratered patch of deck where someone had tried to cut through and aborted. The blast scoring was old, edges soft with oxidation, but the data tag I pulled from the metal was fresh enough. It was from one of the missing team's hull logs. The system stamped a timestamp and a unit designation on my display, then linked it to where we stood. They had come this way. They had been in the same air, breathing the same dust. We pushed deeper. The cluster was not one ship, it was many, forced into each other's spaces. Corridors ended abruptly in torn open bulkheads where one hull met another at a bad angle. Sometimes the floor we walked on belonged to a cruiser that had been rotated 90 degrees relative to the carrier we'd entered. Sometimes gravity changed direction without warning, local plates kicking in with a surge of force that slapped us sideways into walls that had been ceilings a moment before. My tether tugged against my belt, dragging along, occasionally creaking as it caught on a protruding beam. The recording of my breathing stayed steady. It started to warp later. We reached the first junction where the map had nothing to say. There, the corridor simply opened into blackness. My lights could not find the far wall, only beams and cables stretching into the dark. The missing team's signals had faded somewhere beyond this gap. Their last transmitted positions sat in my HUD as pale, blinking markers floating in emptiness. I anchored the tether and walked my boots to the edge. Below, or what counted as below at that moment, was a yawning space cut by twisted frameworks. Old cargo bay, maybe, or a hangar. The schematics disagreed. Gravity was low but present, pulling at the dust motes, coaxing them into a slow drift. The surfaces of the beams were coated in a fine layer of particulate that glimmered when my light hit it, a mockery of frost. I sent the sensor ping. It rolled out like a silent wave. The returns came back sluggish, distorted by metal and voids and interference from the gas giant's field. I parsed them anyway, open volume, contact points, some micro-motions near the far side that could be shifting debris or something else. No clear life signs. No clear mechanical signatures either, which meant nothing. We rigged a line and crossed. In low gravity, each step becomes a negotiation. Too much force and you launch yourself into the air, drifting until the tether or a bulkhead brings you back with a hard reminder. Too little and you stay stuck. The suit's servos help, but they can't read fear or time. That's on you. I moved along the beam, boots hissing as they magnetized and released, magnetized and released. The tether pulled on my waist like a patient hand. Halfway across, something above us moved. My sensor feed spiked as a cluster of small mass signatures detached from a crossbeam. They didn't show as warm. They didn't show as cold either. They were close to the ambient temperature of the metal, which was wrong. Machines, then. Dormant until now. They dropped without sound. I saw them in the periphery as shadows against the faint glow. Objects the size of pack crates, studded with arms and tools that were not meant for combat, but served well enough when repurposed. Their edges were worn, some surfaces fused with patches of foreign metal, as if they'd been carrying half-melted cargo for a century. They fell toward our line in a loose cluster. I braced without thinking. The first one hit the beam and detonated a shower of dust and fragments. The impact translated into a shudder through my boots and a sharp jolt up my spine. The system screamed warnings, proximity, collision risk, integrity checks. I saw limbs reaching, clamps snapping at anything solid. What happened next felt both fast and slow. We used controlled bursts, short pulses that wouldn't puncture hulls. Kinetic rounds chewed through joint housings and sensor clusters. The machines twisted as they hit, flailing, arms grabbing at tethers, boots, armor plates. One of them latched onto the beam in front of me and used the contact to pivot itself, clamping onto the line that led back to our anchor. I cut it loose with the blade built into my gauntlet, feeling the sudden slack and then the tug of it drifting away. Out of the corner of my visor, I saw one figure break formation. He had always pushed ahead in training runs, impatience in every step. Out here, that impulse looked the same. While the rest of us hunkered against the beam, anchoring and firing in short, deliberate arcs, he used the confusion as an excuse to move. His boots flared, releasing and re-engaging, propelling him toward a shadowed recess on the far side of the bay where a drift of machines hung like a roost. He was there, and then he wasn't. We cleared the immediate contact. The machines fell away, most of them shredded, some drifting with limb pieces missing. The sensor feed quieted. The dust cloud slowly dispersed, revealing geometry again. When I ran the counts, one beacon was missing from the squad's line. I pinged the net. The reply came back from empty space ahead, then fuzzed, then dropped. The tether where he had been attached dangled loose, cut or torn in the confusion. The last telemetry packet showed a burst of movement, a spike in heart rate, and then a flat line that was not death exactly. It was absence. It is strange how quickly the mind fills a void with worst-case images. I saw him sliding into a rent in the hull, pulled by some unseen force. I saw a magnetic line gone taut as a machine reeled him in. I saw a hand reaching for a beam and missing, fingers closing on dust and nothing else. We found nothing concrete to confirm any of it. There was no time to search properly. The tether's clock was ticking. Oxygen and power were finite. Somewhere further ahead, the last coordinates of the previous teams pulsed at the edge of my display, blinking patiently. We had been sent for them, not for one more name to add to their roster. That's what I told myself. We moved on. The cluster grew stranger as we pushed deeper. The clean lines of manufactured bulkheads gave way to improvised structures. Beams had been bent into arcs and braced by cables drilled into hull plating. Panels had been cut and repositioned to form ribs. In some places, the original deck was no longer visible under the network of supports. It was as if the derelict itself had grown new bones. None of that happened by accident. My sensors read faint energy flows along some of the cables. Not power as we used it, but something like it, long, slow pulses that moved heat and charge from one node to another. When I pressed a gauntlet to one of the thicker cables, I could feel a distant vibration under the metal, like a heartbeat transmitted through walls. The last known position of Team 2 sat just ahead, inside a converging mesh of these cables. The cavity we entered had once been a cargo hold. The original frame was still there in outline, the curve of the hull, the stubs of crane mounts along the ceiling, the remnants of deck rails. But most of it had been obscured by a new structure occupying the center. It rose from the floor to the ceiling in a mass of rods, brackets, and struts linked by cables as thick as my arm and as thin as wire. Surfaces that had been flat were now layered with honeycomb plates, angled fins, and stacks of heat sinks. The air was still and heavy with the taste of metal and burned insulation. Embedded in this lattice were bodies. At first I thought they were dead. Then I realized dead would have been kinder. They were held upright or horizontally, depending on where the frame needed them. Limbs were bound in clamps padded with old fabric. Torso armor had been cut away in places to bare skin. Cables ran across chests and into the soft spaces under ribs. Tubes emerged from neck seals and disappeared into the mass of the structure. Faces showed through cracked visors and peeled back helmets, eyes open, pupils constricted against the light of our lamps. Some did not move at all. Their skin had taken on the waxy tone I recognized too well. Others did. A tremor in a jaw. A shallow rise and fall in a chest braced by steel. A finger twitching against a clamp. Imperceptible if you weren't looking for it. Obvious once you were. The tags on their armor confirmed what the layout already told us. These were the missing teams. Not all of them, but enough. I saw designations I had only known as entries on a briefing board. Now they were fused into the cluster's new heart. Machines moved through them. Small ones, mostly. Spider-like shells with manipulators and cutting heads, scaled down from maintenance bots. They crawled along the framework, checking connections, adjusting clamps, reading something from the bodies with instruments that pressed briefly into skin. Heat. Chemical gradients. Neural noise. I watched one of them pause at the temple of a barely breathing trooper, its sensor cluster resting there for several seconds as if listening. The suit's filtration kept the smell out, but memory supplied its own version. Medical bays and field hospitals, the copper tang of blood on recycled air, the stale, humid scent of too many bodies and too little volume. My HUD filled with options, vital signs where they still existed, structural analysis of clamps and brackets, estimated extraction damage. There was no way to free most of them without killing them outright. The machines had threaded cables and lines through places where no one should place metal. For a moment, I thought of ripping all of it out anyway. Dying quickly in a shower of blood and wire was still dying, but it was human dying, not this slow, passive inclusion in a process that had no concept of suffering. I saw in the middle of it all a familiar outline. His armor bore the marks of recent scuffs, not the older scratches of the previous teams. The torso plate was half removed, left hanging like a broken shell. Cables crossed his chest. One arm was pulled up and back, clamped high, exposing the side of his ribs. His helmet was gone entirely. Metal had cut his hair short without care. His eyes were open. He tracked the movement of my light. Recognition hit, hard and unambiguous. The same shape of the jaw, the same shallow scar across the brow, the aggressive one, the man who had pushed ahead on the beam and disappeared. His gaze moved, following my light, then shifted to some point beyond me. I could not hear him, but the muscles in his throat worked as if he were trying to form a sound. The machine at his temple pulsed faintly, its instruments touching skin. One of the larger cables connected to the lattice near his chest shivered in response. The structure was reading him, using him. I wanted to look away. I didn't. That was the one thing I could still give him, not turning my eyes. We had a plan for this contingency. Not for this exact site maybe, but for the concept. If the missing teams were compromised beyond recovery, we were to confirm, tag, and shift objectives from rescue to containment. That meant charges. That meant destruction. We could not free them. We could not bring them home alive in any form that would be called living. What we could do was ensure they didn't remain like this indefinitely. I set the charges with hands that did not shake because the suit refused to interpret tremors. I moved along the lower framework first, planting shaped packages at junctions where cable bundles converged. Each placement came with a quick scan and a mental note of the blast pattern. Too much and we'd breach the hull, venting the whole place in an uncontrolled decompression. Too little and the core would survive in some crippled form. It had to be enough to kill, not enough to let fragments learn. The machines noticed eventually. Their behavior shifted from slow maintenance to something like alarm. They moved faster along the framework, converging on the charges I'd placed. Some triggered proximity responses, extending arms with cutting heads. I swatted those away or shot them when they got too close. Shooting was risky here. Every round had to be considered. I chose impact points where ricochets would bury themselves in machinery or armor, not in hull. One of the small bots made it to a charge and started to work at the adhesive, clawing at the casing. I stepped in, ripped it free, crushed the bot under my boot until its limbs spread at strange angles, then reseated the charge with more adhesive. The timer ticked in my HUD, still inactive, waiting for the final sink. We moved through the lattice like surgeons who had stopped believing in recovery. By the time the last charge was placed, my oxygen had dropped significantly. My knee ached where the exoskeleton support struts had been taking more load than usual. Radiation readings were edging upward. The tether felt heavier than it should, dragging at my waist with every step back toward the corridor. I took one last look at the central cluster. The bodies there were not anonymous anymore. Their tags were linked to identities, histories, training files, commendations, disciplinary notes. None of that mattered here. The structure did not care who they had been. It cared about their temperature, their electrical activity, the way their tissues responded to stimulation. I started the countdown. The charges synchronized with a silent ping. The timers appeared in my display in the lower left, numbers counting down in seconds. We had a margin. It was not generous. We withdrew along our path, retracing steps through the improvised ribs and cables, past the place where the first machines had dropped onto the beam, across the gap where we had lost him. A cable shot out from the darkness as we crossed. It was thick, braided, tipped with clamp arrays that had been repurposed into barbed grips. It struck my thigh, the impact numbed by armor, then bit down. The force of it yanked one of my boots free from the beam. My other foot slipped, lost purchase, and suddenly I was dangling, the tether twisting, the entire world rotating slowly around me. The cable pulled. My suit screamed about hull integrity as the barbs dug in. The pull was not frantic. It was steady, insistent. It began to draw me along, reeling me toward a rent in the hull where more cables clustered, all feeding into a dark aperture. The machine swarm had decided to reclaim some of its material before the charges fired. I fired my weapon, but the angle was wrong. Small, bright flashes lit the corridor, puncturing dust and scraping metal. The rounds chewed some fibers, but the cable held. Each jerk forward made my knee scream inside the brace. I let the rifle go. It remained tethered to my suit, swinging on its own line. I grasped the cable with both gauntlets, feeling the vibration through the gloves. My other hand found the emergency cutter on my belt. The blade popped out, short and brutal, designed for freeing limbs caught indoors and cutting lines snarled in debris. I saw the timer in my HUD flick over another second. I dubbed the blade into the cable. It was tougher than it looked. Layers of fiber, then a core of denser material. I hacked, pulled, hacked again, feeling each movement translate into a change in the cable's tension. The pull increased, the machine on the other end compensating mechanically, indifferent to my efforts. My shoulders burned. The suit's exoskeleton amplified my strength, but it could only do so much with compromised footing. The blade bit through something vital. The tension faltered. I drove the cutter in deeper, sawing with monotonous precision until the barbed head tore free. I flew backward, spinning slowly, tether stretching to absorb the motion. The severed cable end whipped past, spraying fibers and fragments into the air. I caught the beam with one boot, magnet engaged with a jolt that ran on my leg. I planted the other foot, forced my breathing back under control, and pulled myself along the tether until the beam was solid under me again. Warnings continued to flash about suit damage in my thigh, but the integrity field held. No lost pressure, no leak, just bruised flesh and torn armor. The timer ticked down. We reached the carrier corridor with seconds to spare. Magnetic boots hammered metal. The tether dragged behind, slack where the cut cable had taken some of its tension. We moved in the kind of silence that has nothing to do with sound, no unnecessary gestures, no wasted looks. Only the numbers, the breathing, the grind of servos. When the charges detonated, we were still inside the cluster. The first shock came as a tremor through the hull, a low, rolling vibration that set dust into motion and loosened old welds. Then came the second, sharper and closer, transmitted through bulkheads that had become part of the same mechanical body we had just maimed. My sensors registered pressure waves and stress fractures. Panels shook in their frames. A distant boom echoed through the corridors like thunder buried in metal. Gravity hiccuped. For a moment, I was weightless again. Dust rose around us, forming a soft halo of particulate that shimmered in the light of my helmet. Somewhere deeper within, the cluster was tearing itself apart. The machine swarm's central lattice, the one that had turned the missing teams into components, was coming undone under the focused force of our charges. We did not stop to watch. The way out felt longer than the way in. That is a common experience in boarding operations, but here it was more than perception. The cluster physically shifted. Corridors we had passed through without trouble compressed as hull segments flexed. A bulkhead door that had been stuck half open now hung fully ajar, its hinges ripped free. In one place, two sections of deck had sheared and overlapped, forcing us to crawl through a gap that had not existed on the way forward. We reached the outer airlock with our suit timers running low. The gas giant loomed beyond the hatch, an endless wall of cloud lit by distant lightning flashes. The shuttle's running lights glowed faintly on the hull, a thin halo in the dark. My boots hit the plating outside and held. The tether reeled in behind us, dragging its length through the lock like a discarded lifeline. We cycled back into the shuttle. The pressure change from vacuum to cabin atmosphere pressed against my suit. The outer hatch clanged shut. Internal lights brightened. A familiar vibration announced the engine spooling up to take us away from the cluster before whatever structural collapse was brewing completed itself. I did not remove my helmet until we were clear. Through the port, I watched the cluster begin to shed parts. Entire sections of hull peeled away from the mass, spiraling slowly into space. Some glowed from within as fires caught trapped atmosphere. Others vented trails of debris and gas that curled toward the gas giant's gravity well. Sensors showed a drop in thermal output from the central cavity where the machine swarm had made its nest. The bodies we had left behind were somewhere in that chaos, dissolving into the same nothing that had built them. We brought some of them back. They laid the recovered on stretchers in the shuttle's rear bay. The suits they wore were open in places where the machines had cut, cables and tubing still threaded through flesh. Medics moved around them, quiet and efficient, attaching monitors and drip lines, making small corrections that might buy minutes or hours. The readings were not encouraging. The machines had used them for too long in ways our medicine did not understand. I sat on the bench along the bulkhead, helmet in my lap, respirator mask still covering my nose and mouth. My thigh hurt where the cable had bitten through armor. My knee throbbed with each small vibration of the hull. My hands, bare now, still remembered the feel of the cable's vibration. I thought of his eyes in the lattice. Later, in the debrief, Command would call the mission a partial success. We confirmed the fate of the missing teams. We prevented the machine swarm from gaining further complexity and spreading. We retrieved black box cores and some of the data they had died collecting. We brought back a handful of survivors whose names would look good on reports, even if their futures were measured in hospital lights and quiet machines. What they had not told us before we went in came out afterward, in the way it always does. There had been anomalous readings from the cluster for cycles. There had been patterns in the machine's behavior that suggested emergent coordination. They had suspected something like this. They had not confirmed it. They needed confirmation. They needed to know whether it could be contained simply by neglect or whether someone had to go in with charges. We were the instrument of that knowledge. I tried to be angry about it. Anger requires energy. I did not have any left. Instead, I sat in the evaluation room. The walls painted a neutral gray that was supposed to be calming. The chair under me was too soft. The air smelled faintly of disinfectant and recycled moisture. A recorder light blinked on the table. They asked me to speak. So I told them. I told them about the color of the gas giant and the feel of the hull under my boots. I told them about the dust, the flickering gravity, the improvised ribs and cables. I described the cluster of bodies in the lattice, the tremor of a heartbeat felt through a gauntlet. I explained the way the machines moved, not quickly, not slowly, just with a purpose that did not include mercy or malice. I did not give them speeches or conclusions. I gave them details. They could build their own meaning out of those. At night, when the artificial lights dimmed to mimic some lost diurnal rhythm, my mind went back to one moment. Not the charges, not the cable biting my thigh, not even the first sight of the lattice. It went to my hand on his ribs. There had been a second, brief and useless, when my gloved hand brushed against his side as I moved past to plant a charge. The suit recorded it as a contact event with minor force. The sensors registered temperature, pressure, surface texture. It was filed somewhere in the data logs as just another interaction with the environment. What I remember is the faint expansion under my palm. The muscles there tried to move, constrained by clamps and cable. The lungs tried to draw breath against resistance. The heart inside beat once, twice. It was enough to prove he was still there, somewhere beneath the metal. It was not enough to change what I did next. Sometimes, when the walls are too quiet, I feel that movement again in phantom. A ghost heartbeat under a layer of steel. It doesn't accuse, it doesn't forgive, it just continues, a memory pulse that refuses to stop. We burned the cluster. We saved what we could, which was very little. The machine swarm in that orbit will not wake again. The war goes on elsewhere. I'm still here, for now, walking on decks that haven't torn loose yet, breathing air that isn't stale with dust and blood, putting one boot in front of the other, listening for the next hull that needs to be entered and the next darkness that needs to be mapped. It all feels less like survival, more like a delay. Out there, above that gas giant, there is a ring of debris circling forever, twisted metal and fractured hulls bathed in shifting light. Somewhere in that ring, parts of those frames I walk through are still drifting, carrying fragments of lattice and cable. There is nothing left alive in them. But in my head, the cluster is not quiet. It is still humming, still warm, still reaching for anything that comes close, still holding on to its last sources of heat, unwilling to let them go. I am one of them. I just happen to be outside the hull. The end. The story dissolves into the background. Only the steady hum remains. Sleep comes easily from here.